Let's take a look at the AI trade. It's booming right now. NVIDIA shares hitting an all-time high in the stock on an upward swing since its strong earnings report in May, seeing a big turnaround from earlier this year. Joining me now, we've got Dan Ives, Wedbush Securities Managing Director and Global Head of Technology Research. Dan, great to have you on the program with us. We saw strong third quarter results from Micron, boosted by AI demand. So how does this factor into the broader AI trade and add just another thought in the frame of mind for some of the NVIDIA investors out there as well?
I mean, there's one chip fueling the AI revolution, and that's NVIDIA. And I think investors are starting to recognize we haven't even seen the biggest growth driver yet of AI, not just on enterprise and the use cases, but on the consumer side and ultimately autonomous and robotics. And in my view, it's not just 4 trillion. I mean, we're going to be looking at a $5 trillion market cap in NVIDIA.
And so at what point, what's the kind of modeling and the time frame that you're kind of anticipating that could come to fruition?
Street's still underestimating growth longer term, I think by 15 to 20%. That could be conservative. I think when you actually see the dynamics playing out today, remember, they took China basically out of their forecast. And if you have any trade deal, a big chip on the table is NVIDIA, and I believe they're not going to hand that business on a silver platter to Huawei. So I think right now investors are starting to recognize the growth opportunities for NVIDIA, and we've talked about it, demand to supply 10 to 1.
And so as we're thinking about that, and you mentioned China, one of the major factors within any type of trade deal is going to be IP, that intellectual property. What is the likelihood that we see an outcome on the intellectual property front that is favorable for NVIDIA, and what does that do in terms of unlocking some of that addressable market?
I think probably less for NVIDIA from an IP perspective. I think the bigger issue from an IP, especially a lot of the software players, that's been the big issue when it comes to China. But look, there's a give and take here. And the reality is that Jensen wants that business back. He's talked about it. And, when you think about it, $8 billion a quarter, but eventually that could be 10, 12 billion a quarter. But China, they know that there's only one chip in the world fueling AI revolution. That's the godfather of AI, Jensen, NVIDIA.
We've heard some really strong calls for even $6 trillion market caps for NVIDIA here. What is, you think, the critical kind of checklist in order for us to get to that point?
I think checklist is, and just take all the geopolitical out for a second, but I think first it's the use cases that are now exploding. And we're seeing that in the hyperscale and Microsoft, of course, names like Palantir, which continues to be one of our top names. Then it's the consumer piece, everything Zuckerberg and Meta's doing, what we're seeing with Alphabet and others, because that's a whole nother leg to the stool in terms of the consumer side. And then the holy grail, autonomous, robotics, humanoids, that's not even being factored in here today.
And so you mentioned a few of the other themes that I wanted to get to as well here. You, of course, are tracking Palantir and another name that's seen new record highs. What do you think is really contributing to the mindset around the trading and the thesis for Palantir right now?
Look, I mean, they hate it at 20, despise it at 70, call it expensive at 100, right? I mean, now the bear is 145 because, as we always say, they can't find AI in the spreadsheets when they're in hibernation mode. Palantir, we view as $1 trillion market cap next 2 to 3 years. There's no company from a software perspective that has what they have. And I think now as they go further and further after the enterprise, as sovereigns go down the AI path, this is just the beginning of what's going to be a golden age of Palantir. And I think, look, is it expensive today? Of course. But if you look out 2, 3, 4 years, I mean, we're going to be talking about one of the most transformational companies in the world.
And so within that transformation, they also might need to see a transformation of their own that you started to allude to there. And I just want to hit on that because they often talk about how much their contracts are intertwined with government entities. To what extent do you think we see that start to accelerate towards large enterprises with large recurring run rates as well?
Yeah, and look, that's been a huge part of the valuation uplift that we've seen over the last 18, 24 months, because now more and more they're an enterprise play. Government never really get a multiple, just given the nature of contracts. Now in the enterprise, there's no AI bake-off that Palantir's not front and center. Either they won or they're going to be at top of the list. And I think that's really been the difference maker is on the enterprise and investors recognizing they're one of the biggest disruptive technology companies in the world, along with NVIDIA, along with Tesla, and I think this is just the beginning of that next chapter.
Dan, just lastly while we have you, and I got to be brief, just going to throw it out there. Cybersecurity in the age of geopolitical conflict, how much more do you think that gets the mind of investors, considering what we've watched play out over the last several weeks here? And, oh yeah, by the way, we still have a deadline that's looming on the tariff policy front as well.
Just another talent for CyberArk, Palo, CrowdStrike, Zscaler. Even when you talk about retaliatory, we saw that with Iran, or retaliatory cyber toward U.S. Israel, it benefits cybersecurity companies. That's why it's going to continue to be, I think, probably the biggest outperformer within broader tech. And that's why we also have a bunch of cybersecurity in our IVES AI 30, because that's the second, third derivative of AI.
And then, Dan, just lastly here, because, and I do want to get to our next guest, who is sitting on set with me. And one of the questions that he slid me, Thomas Hayes, who I'm sure you know well as well, he slid me a question saying there's 10-to-1 demand to supply for NVIDIA on the chips front. Do we need more progress on fabrication, especially considering TSMC and Intel right now, to help fulfill some of that demand?
That's a great, and he's great, and that's a great question. It's true. I mean, because ultimately you need more supply, you need more production. The problem is, like, look, Intel, I mean, they're stuck in that right lane, 45 miles an hour in a minivan, right? Like, so that's part of the problem. But it's a demand supply issue. Demand's not the problem, it's supply.